The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Woman, life, freedom. That was the rallying cry at demonstrations across Iran and heard around the world after the death of a young woman detained by police. Tonight, the significance of those protests and the state's reaction to them. Then, Jayan Jagannathan hears the case for queer history to include not just the good guys, but also what authors Ben Miller and Hugh Lemmy call bad gays. It's Thursday, September 29th, and that's tonight on The Agenda. Women took to the streets in some 40 cities in Iran this month after the tragic death of a young woman named Mahsa Amini, who was detained by the so-called morality police. And women around the world have added their voices since, turning out for demonstrations by the thousands in solidarity. What happens next could be momentous or crushing. With us for their views, in New Delhi, India, Ramin Jahanbegloo, Director, Mahatma Gandhi Center on Nonviolence and Peace. In Waterloo, Ontario, Besma Momani, Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo and Senior Fellow at CG, the Center for International Governance and Innovation. And here in our studio, Haide Mogisi, Emerita Professor and Trudeau Fellow at York University. Hello to you all.
Hello.
This is a somber conversation, but a very important conversation. And Haide, I wanted to start with you because when we were talking before we started taping, I asked you what this moment feels like for you, and you said that it was exciting but painful. What did you mean by that?
I mean that it's very exciting, elating, I would say, watching what's happening in the streets of Tehran. This is a really unbelievable uprising like no others that we have had many of them in the last decade or so in Iran. But this one is quite unique in terms of not only the composition of the protesters on the streets, but on some of the initiatives and particularly the slogan, women, life, freedom. Zan, Zendegi, Azadi that they are using, and it has become the motto of the protesters nationwide.
You mentioned that one of the rallying calls is woman, life, freedom. Besma, what is the latest that you're hearing about the protests?
Well, they're certainly continuing, and there's already reports of arrests of perhaps 1,200. That's sort of what's known. It maybe even is more than that. The protests are across the entire country. Very interesting. It perhaps started off maybe in the Northwest, but it's really spread into all parts of the country. And the composition of the protesters themselves is far more diverse. It started off perhaps with more of a women focus, but it's increasingly become very much a wide mass protest movement. There is a lot of fear, palpable fear, I'm sure, partly because I think even today we've heard, the president, Raisi, come out saying that, this sort of chaos, quote unquote, won't be accepted. That's a precursor to the kind of, things that Heidi was mentioning that really is going to be before us. So the crackdown is imminent. I don't think we can ignore that. The internet keeps getting throttled. Evening hours are really the time that they've tried to turn off the internet as much as possible. In fact, I think we're seeing from the diaspora communities getting less and less contact with their family members, and certainly there's less and less videos coming out of Iran, which really does portend a very, I think, scary prognosis, which is that the government really is preparing for that crackdown.
Ramin, Besma mentioned that, the internet has been cut off and on, and it's hard to get information out of the country. Let's go back to how this all started. What started these protests?
Well, what started these protests was, as we know, the killing of Mahsa Amini, a woman who was actually protesting somehow against mandatory wearing of the hijab, but I think that mostly what started it was also the fact that there has been a generation change, and we cannot compare today's protests with what happened in Iran in 2000 2009 or in 2019, for the good reason that these protests that we see today, they are very spontaneous. They do not have a defined political leadership, and they have no ideology. Now, in 2009, it was practically, the millions of Iranians came out to protest against a fraudulent election, but it meant that they wanted to vote, and it was headed by two reformists of the Islamic Republic. This is not the case anymore. Actually, we see that in today's Iran, there is no fear among especially younger women, but also young men. And this fear, which existed for the parents and grandparents, I would say, for a long time, has been transformed into a kind of anger. And what was a dream for the parents and grandparents has become reality for them.
I want to come back to what you just said. What was a dream for the grandparents has become a reality for the young people now. But Besma, I just wanted to talk a bit more of how this started. And this was after the death of Mahsa Amini, also known as Gina, a 22-year-old who was stopped by the morality police. Who is the morality police, Besma?
Well, unfortunately, it's as it sounds. It's a police force and really equipped as such to roam much of the streets to look for people who, in their view, are not following the moral code. And in this case, it's usually mostly women, although certainly some men have also been stopped by the morality police, not to suggest that they're not. But people who don't follow the attire, who may be showing public expressions of affections, particularly people that are not their, their partners, all of that kind of repression that one would find in these situations. I think a context I wanted to just mention about Mahsa, of course, she comes from a Kurdish region. She is from an ethnic minority. And so this did, and not to suggest that there is, there's certainly grievances amongst the Kurdish community and certainly grievances amongst other ethnic communities in Iran for how they are treated by the regime. But there's still not clarity as to whether or not she was targeted for her Kurdish identity. Perhaps she had an accent. She's not from Tehran. She was coming to Tehran to visit family and was again spotted by the morality police. And the morality police, I'll just point out as well, they have their ebbs and flows in terms of when they've really turned on the pressure. And the context here is really important because, in fact, the morality police have, I'd say, doubled down in the past few years, and even more so since the current president has come to power last year. And that's really the important context here. As Ramin noted that, there is no fear, but increasingly I find that, the Iranians have less and less hope in the sense of things changing inside the country. I mean, there's hopeful about this movement as being a revolutionary one, but there's less and less hope that things are going to get better. And in some ways, some of the previous protests, you could kind of perhaps point to a few things, some potential silver linings, and we talked about reformists in government, but, this is a doubling down of the fundamentalists back now in power. Raisi pretty much rigged the entire election to ensure his coming to power. There's signs that he may even be the one that's now going to become the supreme leader. I mean, this is a political context that's getting worse and worse by the day. So yes, there's no fear, but partly there's no fear because there's no hope. The hope of things getting better in Iran is fading by the moment. And unfortunately, that's what makes these protests very different, in my view, than the previous ones, because at least maybe there was hope, although I think many would argue that the entire, Islamic Republic had no hope of succeeding by the very nature of the way it was constituted. But this president, this government coming to power, and the prospects for seeing no change from the reformists is really adding, I think, the fuel to the fire.
Haide, Besma mentioned that there is no hope, but before Ramin mentioned that this was the grandparents' dream, but is becoming a reality. On March 7th, 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini announced that all women must wear hijab. You were there, so you're connected to this in a different kind of way. Can you tell us about your personal story?
Yes, I would definitely love to do that. But before actually that, I want to add something in terms of what Ramin and Basma said. And that is the most remarkable aspect of this uprising is not only, the militancy and the differences that Basma actually counted, but the very fact that women started this uprising and women are leading this uprising. So this is something that, not only this one, but also the very fact that the men, the young men and old, whoever is on the streets, they are accepting not only the leadership of the women, but also using the slogan, the motto, women, life, freedom. I mean, this is really a movement of importance, not only for Iran. I would say it has a global caliber, as we see from the enormous support that they are getting from Turkey to Syria to the Western countries. So many artists, so many musicians, so many celebrities, so to speak, come out, make clippings and send statements of support, because many people feel affinity with this slogan. So this is the most remarkable aspect of this. And in terms of the arrests that are being made, let's not forget that it's not only the protesters that the government is actually cracking down on. Right now, we have information that over 20 journalists and photojournalists have been arrested, some lawyers, but particularly I want to mention the name of Nilufar Hamedi, the woman who was the first one who went to the hospital and reported on the state of affairs, and they took a photograph of this Mahda, and that was that is what ignited the whole
You sound more hopeful, but she's been arrested, that journalist.
That's it. That's why I'm saying that particularly this woman, that immediately they arrested and along with her colleagues. So, these are some of the aspects of this uprising that is, in my view, they are much more important than some of the political, backgrounds and foundations of this protest.
Well, tell us about your experience in 1979.
Yes, you mentioned that on the eve of International Women's Day, March 8th, there were actually statements, advertisements about a rally that was being organized by women on the occasion of International Women's Day. And Ayatollah Khomeini chose that particular night actually to announce that women should cover up. And it is quite funny because he mentioned that women are going to offices and to places naked. And one of our renowned historians, late Homan Ater, who spoke to the media, said that, come on, this is winter. How could women go to the offices naked? Making, a joke somehow of this statement. In any case, we went to the rallying place, but women were not in a mood to sit down and listen to lectures. So poured on the streets, and basically we were there for the whole day, and we were pressured from both sides by the Hezbollahis, the tags, and the regime suppressive apparatuses. I myself, actually, at those days, they wouldn't shoot at women. That was the beginning of the revolution. But they were pushing us from both sides. I myself my neck was hurt, actually, and was in neck brace for 40 days. But, at that point, the regime retreated because, they were shocked by this response by women from all walks of life. But it took about a year after the separation of all political parties, all organizations, all decent, and then they made mandatory hijab legal, and the women who were defying hijab were subjected to beating and fines and arrests, and then 43 years that women have lived under this terror.
You mentioned that at the time that they didn't harm women, maybe some pushing and shoving. We're seeing images of rubber bullets being used, and we know there's unconfirmed reports of how many people have died. And Ramin, you felt the consequences of the regime. You were imprisoned in Iran. What happened?
Well, I think it's very, going to prison in Iran is a very difficult matter because actually they keep, especially in the confinement, in solitary confinement. And I was in solitary confinement for 125 days. Of course, prisoners cannot see each other. Some of them are like myself, were intellectuals or civic actors. Some of them were more engaged in ethnic groups or in political parties. But I want to come back to what Heidi said and to relate it to what you've been asking me. Actually, it's all about the nature of the evil in the Iranian regime. I think that our viewers will understand much better what is the nature of the Iranian regime if I tell them that Iranian regime is a mixture of the Spanish Inquisition and Al Capone, the organized crime. Because you have a lot of corruption, you have a lot of violence. Actually, it's inherent in the nature, political nature of the Iranian regime to be violent. Now, this violence for 43 years has targeted women, especially. And why women? Because, especially younger women, because younger Iranian women are beautiful, they are well dressed. They put perfumes on themselves. They are clever. They are 70% of the entrance in the exams, the entrance exams for the universities. So everything that people who hate women and they are against them in this regime, they don't want to have. They don't want them to have. So that's why they've been harnessing, actually violating the human rights of women, the women's rights, and this is why I think that women have been the target of the Iranian regime for 43 years. This is not the first time that a woman is killed in custody. Actually, one of the women who was killed in custody, we have to remind our viewers, was Zahra Kazemi, who was an Iranian Canadian, as you know, photographer. So this killing has been going for a long period of time of killing of women. But this time, I think with this generation, they said enough is enough. And actually, because they have become fearless and because they have grown up with a parallel, I would say, life of information through the internet, through Twitter, through YouTube, through a lot of fake Telegram, they made their own world. Which was completely absent, I would say, in the beginnings of the revolution. And now we can see that how they don't care about only economic mismanagement or the nuclear deal. What they care about is that the regime has to go, and they don't want that. So I'm not saying that democracy is around the corner, actually, but I'm sure that this is a point of no return for the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Heidi, I know you want to come in on this, but I want to go to Besma really quickly. Besma, we know that women in Iran are extremely educated. The majority of them are in STEM. And we've seen on social media women around the world cutting their hair in solidarity. There's a Turkish singer who cut her hair off on stage afterwards. And I know when these things happen, there's a tendency for women from other parts of the world not hijacking, but maybe inserting themselves in what's happening and not fully understanding the context, as you were talking about before. So how have these protests changed global conversations around feminism?
Yeah, and look, I mean, I think there's, of course, benefit for the global feminist movement to be inspired by the Iranian women. And of course, they all share a common core message of the fact that women have a right to have agency over their own body. And certainly that is something that resonates. But I think it's really important for particularly Western feminists not to intercede in the conversation or to really make this about them. You know, unfortunately, we saw some ill-timed commentary that came out of particularly some political women in the United States talking about how this is really related to the abortion laws in the United States and so forth. And again, that's not to take away from that very important debate, but I think the Iranian women really want solidarity with their movement. You know, the pressure that Iranian women have is different. You know, there isn't morality police roaming in the United States in the same way that you found in Iran. This is a very unique context, and Iranian women have suffered. They are the ire of the morality police often, and are the ones that have really suffered greatly. And as Ramin noted, you know, they are highly, highly intelligent. Again, I can't express how lucky Canada is, and the United States in particular, as being the beneficiary of the enormous brain drain coming out of Iran. We are the beneficiary of all these talented people, including the two colleagues on this panel. You know, this is really the sad reality of Iran. The folks, people there have really lost hope and really just want to migrate, want to leave. You know, as a professor in a STEM-based university, I can tell you we are, again, the beneficiary of all this great talent. But I can't tell you the amount of emails that I get from Iranians almost daily, and I'm sure a lot of my colleagues across this country share the sentiment of wanting to get out. Brilliant, brilliant people. I think this is what is really so sad, because one knows that the potential of this country is so great, if only it wasn't ruined by this mafia, as Ramin pointed out. Not only are they corrupt morally, in my view, in terms of their imposition of a theocracy, but they're also just embedded in the entire economic structure. So not only are they political, morally corrupt, they're also economically corrupt, and that again takes away that hope. And so this culmination of all that is really what we see today, and I'm really so impressed by Iranian women. They really have been impressive before this movement, and I think yet again, and there's so many great Iranian icons of many previous protest movements as well. Mahsa will go down with so many other enormously talented women who have been, unfortunately, been the ire of the state and have really paid the ultimate price.
I wanted just to add to what Ramin said about, the praise that he has for Iranian women, rightly so. But I want to also add the resistance of women throughout these 43 years. I mean, the women started, the protest against Ayatollah's mandatory hijab, but they never stopped fighting for their rights. Sometimes for legal reforms in the family law, for example, very quietly, and sometimes very loudly. Some very prominent Iranians who, resorted to self-burning in protest, and many other forms, for example, the campaign on 1 million imza signature, and many other forms that women have actually adopted to say no to the policies of Islamification by this regime. So this resistance should be recognized and should be respected. And I think one of the reasons that this slogan, women, life, freedom, is adopted by everyone is out of sense of recognition of women's both suffering and resilience and resistance throughout these years. That's why, overwhelming majority of people in Iran right now, being on the streets or not, they recognize this fact. And they recognize the fact that if they want democracy and freedom, there is no way that they can achieve it without recognizing and working for the gender democracy and freedom in the country. So it is very important. And the affinity that the young people, actually, the young men feel about all these facts that was mentioned. Right now, we have information and the clippings that university students, male university students in protest have started shaving their heads, in public, cutting their hair. I mean, this is remarkable aspects of this uprising.
Would you call this a revolution?
Revolutions happen when people at the bottom actually feel that they can't take it anymore. They are fed up. And those on the top feel problems in terms of cracks within their own ranks or out of exhaustion after all, it is exhausting the way they are suppressing people. And that's when revolutions happen. I wouldn't necessarily call this movement or uprising a revolution, but definitely this is the most remarkable event that has happened in Iran. Yes, Iran has seen many, many revolutions, I would say, at least 3 major revolutions in the past since 1905, and many movements, but nothing like this. And I would really give credit mostly to Iranian women, young and old, who have fought all through these 43 years with everything that has been at their disposal. And also, I want to mention, that by saying this, I'm not reducing what's happening in Iran only to the question of hijab and women's demands for their rights. Iran's economy is in deep crisis right now. I mean, forget about the corruption, forget about, the abuse of power, but economic matters are very, very important for the lives of people. These young people who are on the streets, for example, have been denigrated, insulted. You wouldn't believe, some of the excuses that this regime has for ridiculous things that they demand of these youth in Iran. Like, for example, not even wearing sunglasses or being arrested, questioned or insulted by having short sleeve shirts, so on and so forth. And add this to the rampant unemployment for youth is now, according to International Labour Organization, 27%. I mean, the inflation that is 50%, and for some items, 80%. So these are very important, facts and important reasons for these uprisings. But of course, Mahsa's murder, cold-blooded murder, triggered these uprisings.
Besma, Haide mentioned all the economic strife that's happening in the country. We know that the supreme leader is 83 years old. The Iranian government doesn't report, and the state media, they don't report on his health, but they have been unverified reports saying that he recently had a health scare. How does his age factor into the protests and what's happening right now?
I mean, it's a factor. I mean, Iran is run by geriatrics. That's the sad part. I mean, there's just, so many people who are so out of touch with the young people on the street, and that only adds to the frustration furthermore. In terms of the supreme leader, we've been hearing about his ailments and, his eventual death for so long now. I think people are even fed up of that conversation internally. Of course, what makes it worse, too, is that Raisi that's the current president, who is a real hardliner and has enormous blood on his hand from years past and, crushing political protesters in 1988 and throughout. He has been, people think, perhaps being the one that's going to be chosen as the next supreme leader. And this is really, I think, part of his rationale that he's, in fact, doubling down, trying to prove his fundamentalist credentials to the other ayatollahs. And this is even scarier prospect. That's what I mean about, even less and less hope for change. as I alluded to, at some point there was hope that perhaps some reformers, and I put that in quotation marks because I think a lot of people still think that they're very objectionable in many ways. But, that maybe was opening up some level of hope that there could be some change along the margins. But that's been shut down. And that's what's really, I think, important here, because if the supreme leader does die imminently and he is replaced by another hardliner, which I think is, you can just see it, it's in the cards. And the government has been completely stacked with hardliners. There's just no hope for that, again, change at the margins. And that's not that's not going to be satisfactory to the vast majority of Iranians. They don't want change at the margins. They want wholesale overthrow and change it completely, because it is rotten to the core. But again, that context is really important. I think it's really adding more to the fuel to the fire, as I said.
Ramin, we have about 30 seconds left, but do you see the government making any concessions around what's happening right now in Iran?
I think that, first of all, the supreme leader is already dead in the mind of most of the Iranians. So I think the matter is that the Iranian regime cannot continue in the same path, and I think that the future is very uncertain for the Islamic Republic, and especially because of the people. Actually, I think that in a couple of weeks we will see the working class already. The teachers and the universities have joined the youngsters. And we might have also the truck drivers, we might have also other parts of the population. So if that happens, actually, I think it's going to be really very difficult for the Iranian regime to keep itself all together.
I really appreciate all of your time and helping us understand this issue better. And Ramin and Haideh, it's not easy to share memories of dark times, and we appreciate you doing that tonight with us. Thank you so much,
Pleasure.
everybody. Appreciate it.
After centuries of persecution, it is understandable that LGBTQ2S communities emphasize the heroes and pioneers of their shared history. But as fans of the podcast Bad Gays already know, there is also much to learn from the villains, outsiders, and even evil queers. It's complicated, and now it's also a book titled Bad Gays, A Homosexual History, and we're joined by the creators of both. In Berlin, Germany on the right, Ben Miller, and in Barcelona, Spain on the left, Hugh Lemmy. Welcome to you both.
Hi, thanks for having us.
So Ben and Hugh, you started a podcast some years ago entitled Bad Gays. Now some of those characters have made their way to the pages of your new book, but before we get to those characters, let me ask you, Ben, what led you to focus on the darker sides of homosexuality? Because it's quite a leap from the language and sort of imagery surrounding the LGBTQ2S movement.
Absolutely. Thanks again for having us. The impetus for the show was that we were constantly frustrated by the yawning gap between the conversations that we were having with our friends about these topics, about queer history, and where the public conversation was. And we found that the conversations that we were having among ourselves were really interesting, were really justice-oriented, were really focused on telling complicated stories and questioning mainstream assumptions, even the kind of mainstream assumptions of the movement. And we didn't see those conversations happening in public-facing media. And so we decided to start the show as a way of hanging some of these big theoretical questions on some fun, sexy, interesting stories that give you all the drama that you want, but also start to bring in some of those themes that we felt really weren't being addressed.
All right, I want to talk a little bit about the drama, and Hugh, I'm coming to you. From its inception, did you get a lot of pushback from this project, even from the podcast and then towards the book as well?
No, absolutely no pushback at all from the podcasts, because I think, as Ben was saying, there's a real appetite out there for these conversations. I think we're all sort of used to Pride Month rolling around, and there's a sort of 10 great queer heroes who you need to know about. And it's the sort of the same stories again and again, which are really important for creating our history, for talking about our identity.
All right, Hugh, let's talk about some of those stories. Let's start with a name that many are familiar with. That's Oscar Wilde. However, the focus in your book is not on Wilde, but on his young lover, Lord Alfred Douglas, known as Boise. Hugh, what made him the right person for your rogue gallery of gays?
Well, we all know, well, if you're aware of the story of Oscar Wilde, who is obviously portrayed very much as a hero of the LGBTQ movement, and especially the sort of one of the early figures who was stood up and said, yes, this is me and I'm not ashamed of it. You might know the story of Bosie, who was his young lover. But that story tends to be told and ends with the trial and then the sad death of Oscar Wilde, the premature death of Oscar Wilde after he's sort of destroyed by his prison sentence. But if you actually look at Bosie's life, the story is, first of all, much more complicated in leading up to that trial. I mean, the Oscar Wilde as a heroic figure should be really complicated anyway, because some of the relationships he was involved in were quite predatory, quite difficult anyway. So that's one aspect of it. But then after Wilde dies, Bosie's life really spins off in a very strange direction, and he renounces his homosexuality. He has a short-lived, disastrous marriage to a young poet who he's very cruel to, and then over the course of the First World War, he becomes involved in, I guess, the proto-fascist movement in England. He writes for the Vigilante, which is a proto-fascist magazine. He adopts a very sort of orthodox Catholicism, and he becomes deeply, deeply anti-Semitic. And so that was one of the stories we're like, well, there's just as much going on there that tells a story about how our identity came to be and our relationship with power, and why did Bosie do these things, as that sort of traditional heroic story about Oscar Wilde standing up for himself. And in standing up for himself and putting himself in public in that way, he really put Bosie in a very difficult position as well, although Bosie forced him to make a lot of those decisions. And the end result being that Bosie really rejected it. So there's a lot of really interesting things to learn from that history about the pressures that were on gay men at that time, and the fact that so many of them in that early movement were not these brave heroes, were very complicated, prejudiced, difficult people for us to talk about.
Ben, you write that homosexuality was invented in the 19th century. Obviously, you didn't mean same-sex attraction. That's been with us for quite some time. Can you break it down? What's the difference here?
Sure. So this is one of the biggest differences between how people who think about and study the history of sexuality a lot think about these identities, and how they're spoken about by the kind of mainstream element of the movement. So when we say that homosexuality dates to about 1870, we don't mean that there is no historical evidence of same-sex desire or gender nonconformity before then. Far from it. Those things have been with us forever, and those things always will be. But the idea that your sexual object choice, right, the person that you are sexually and romantically attracted to, that is a really foundational part of your identity as a human being, and that the difference between a same or a different sex object choice is a really foundational difference in the kind of person you are. And then all of the kind of social institutions that build up around that difference, that is what we're talking about as being new. And so in that sense, heterosexuality is also new. Heterosexuality in the sense of different sex object choice is incredibly important to my self-identity. And we're sort of creating a whole bunch of institutions around this idea of dating leading to marriage and this sort of path of romantic love. In many ways, that's actually a reaction to homosexuality and all of these other things that are being identified by doctors and medical scientists, and then turned into these scandals, and then seemingly quote unquote normal people have to define something for themselves against that. And I think it can be really easy to confuse that argument that I'm making here with this really old homophobic lie, right? The lie that we're used to from all kinds of conservative histories, where, oh, maybe they were just good friends, and okay, it's two people, they're like on the Greek vase, and we can all see what they're doing, right? But if we think a little more deeply about that Greek vase, right, what the same-sex desire, the form that same-sex desire was taking among those elite Greeks who are depicting it on their vases, is that adult men are the insertive partner for younger men, but they're also married, right? And that's not what today's homosexuality looks like. And so we can see from that both the evidence of these forms of desire always existing and also the differences, the real differences in the kind of forms and institutional forms that they take and what they mean to people. And that's kind of what we mean by that. And the stories in the book are really mostly about how we get from point A to point B, right? How we get from same-sex desire as being a thing that exists to same-sex desire becoming such a constitutive part of people's feelings about themselves, and also a major part of the way that they are handled and regulated and dealt with by doctors, by legal authorities, by police. And none of that is particularly self-evident. And so that's what the stories are really about.
So I want to follow up with you, talk about the main protagonist in the first chapter, Roman Emperor Hadrian. How do you handle the problems of describing gayness or homosexuality way before these terms existed? Talk to me about sort of that navigation.
I've always felt, because I'm a historian with academic training and Hugh isn't, I've often felt like the one who has to be that sort of boring person, sort of boring, tendentious person who comes in and raps us on the knuckles and says, well, it was all very different back then. I think the approach that we've come to use in the show, and one that I think is really useful, is that when we apply the label gay, we're not making a definitive claim about someone's identity, right? If you explain to Emperor Hadrian what modern homosexuality was, he'd be just as confused as if you showed him an airplane. What we can do is we can ask ourselves, what does applying this label gay to Hadrian, based on all of these things about him that ended up becoming part of what gay became, tell us about us, less than tell us about him? So yes, it's a story about him and Hadrian, but really when we apply these labels sort of ahistorically, what we're trying to do is look at how these identities came to be and what we learn about ourselves by doing it.
All right, Hugh, with that, I need to ask about Emperor Hadrian. He's viewed as one of the more successful Roman emperors. What made him become a bad character in your book exactly?
I think Hadrian would firmly fall into the category of complicated. It's like evil and complicated. And really, we talk about his relationship with Antinous, his young lover, a young Greek man who he falls in love with, much younger than him, and his very, very complicated relationship, where they sort of travel around the Mediterranean. And the thing to understand about Hadrian is he is a lover of Greece. He's a lover of the Hellenic tradition, and he brings in the idea of Hellenism into Rome, or he rebuilds on this idea of Hellenism, which is this obsession that the Romans had with Greek culture and Greek mythology, Greek history, and art. And he's really an obsessive almost about Greek culture, and he wants to build himself up in the model of the ancient Greeks. And so he takes this young lover, and he sort of takes him back to Greece, where he involves him in all these magical rituals around oracles and these sort of ancient Greek traditions. Finally, then taking him on this sort of tour of the Mediterranean to Egypt, where he involves him in these rites, these magical rites of ancient Egyptian religion, which ends in this very confused way. We don't really know quite what happens, but Antinous either drowns or is drowned in the Nile. Some ancient sources say that it was an accident that he drowned, but some others suggest that actually he was drowned or perhaps committed suicide as a sort of sacrifice for Hadrian. So yeah, there's a super complicated relationship there. And I think the other thing that's very fascinating about Hadrian is a lot of the story of how the gay identity was formed and homosexual identity was formed in the 19th century. In some ways, there's an analogy with the way nationalism is formed. The idea of this thing that has always existed is taken from these stories from the past. So the Victorians in the 19th century in Germany, these men who start to identify as something that we might today think of as homosexual or gay. They look to the past for examples, and they use this history from the past to create our contemporary identity. So in choosing Hadrian, you have on one hand this fascinating story about his own life and his military conquests and his persecution of Jews in Judea. and also his frankly quite crazy sort of love life. And then you also have this story into the 19th century of people looking back towards Hadrian, towards the Greeks, towards the Romans, in order to say, we have always been here. So that's kind of a foundational story as well. And people look to Hadrian right back to Oscar Wilde, for example, and say, not only were we always here, but we've been emperors and kings and artists and writers, and our sexuality, this way that we form our lives around same-sex desire, is not something to be ashamed of, but is a source of greatness. So that's kind of what's so interesting about Hadrian's story, I think.
All right, so we talked about the first character of your book. I want to get to the last character of your book, Pim Fortuyn, who, dies in 2002, is assassinated. Ben, how did he end up in your rogue gallery?
Well, I think we were really interested in looking at what happens to this gay male identity after this really remarkable kind of end zone run that it makes in the 20th century, where at the beginning of the 20th century, it's still in many circles a very fringe concept. And by the end of the 20th century, in countries like the Netherlands, where Pim Fortuyn was a politician, the kind of basic civil rights consensus is starting to be accepted really across the political spectrum. The consensus around things like marriage equality and military service, this kind of civil equality. Pim Fortuyn is someone who starts out on the center left of politics. He then ends up writing a very provocative newspaper column, and then becoming one of the first leaders of this kind of new far right in Europe that we've seen since the early 2000s only gain ground, this kind of post-fascist political, this sort of post-fascist politics of people who are very eager to kind of shed some of the old image connotations of the far right, but are still definitely far-right political figures who are really agitating against immigrants, agitating in favor of white supremacy, and using deindustrialization and using some of these economic challenges as a way to drum up hatred against anyone who looks different, and to propose things like complete bans on immigration to the Netherlands. That was one of Fortuyn's policies. Another one of Fortuyn's policies was, or another one of Fortuyn's political statements, was referring to the entire religion and culture of Islam using a Dutch word that translates in English to retarded. And so this is someone who's really a proud racist, and at the same time builds an enormous amount of political popularity by playing up his homosexuality, giving really outrageous TV interviews where he's talking about the taste of male ejaculate, where he's talking about how being in a dark room is like being in church because you're on your knees and there's low light coming in from a window on the left, where he's talking about how he can't possibly be racist because he likes sleeping with Moroccan men. And all of this is really politically effective because it gives Dutch liberals a pathway towards voting for someone who is very far right, because the kind of assumption is, well, how could you possibly be intolerant if you're voting for me, this very outre, very publicly gay person? He does get assassinated only days before the 2002 elections in the Netherlands, and becomes a kind of Dutch national hero. And that brand of politics is only becoming more current in Germany, where I live, the far-right political party, one of its parliamentary leaders is Alice Fidel, who's lesbian. In France, gay men and lesbians now vote actually more for the far right than voters of their social and economic and racial strata. And so you see this kind of pattern happening a lot, and that's why we thought it was important to talk about Fortuyn's life. And to fit him in as one of our possible endings of the book. There's a more hopeful ending after that, where we talk about all of the ways that solidarity between queer people and other kinds of people has worked. But Fortuyn is our kind of nightmare ending.
I think it's fair to say that, the argument that bad gays must be seen as part of the LGBTQ history has not been quite accepted yet. And I want to talk about a more sort of recent example. The attack that Netflix has recently got around the classification of a new series. It's called Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story. And it was tagged as an LGBTQ sort of material. They got plenty of flack, and it was removed. And Hugh, I want to come to you. You guys actually did an episode on Jeffrey Dahmer. What do you make of this whole situation?
I think it's kind of ridiculous. I think it's a real narrowing down of the possibilities of what gay history can be, and looking at the relationship between Dahmer and sort of the popular conception of homosexuality at the time, which is actually very important. You can sort of make the argument, as Ben does in the podcast, that one of the reasons, obviously, why Dahmer's crimes, obviously on their own right, they made the headlines, but they also had this sort of dual effect of because they occurred contemporaneous at the same time as the first sort of decade of the AIDS crisis, he sort of superimposed in the mind of a heterosexual public in America and a homophobic public this relationship between homosexuality and death. So actually, while obviously he's in no way a sort of gay hero, and the way that those stories are told has been quite complicated and been told quite homophobically in the past. There's so much to learn about homosexuality in the 1980s in the US, its relationship with AIDS, and also with race at the time. That means that to say that this isn't a gay story or isn't an LGBTQ story, I think is missing something. It is part of gay history, and the story that we can tell from it is actually about homophobia and about racism and about the combination, how homophobia and racism really intersected.
All right, let's talk politics a bit. Ben, I want to come to you. Some people who read your book might say that you have a rather critical take on LGBTQ politics. You seem very critical of those who are not left-wing. Why?
Well, we made the decision in this book to be very honest about where we're coming from, to show our work and how we got there. And if people want to disagree, then they can. But I don't think it would have made any sense for us to write a book that didn't pretend that we weren't coming from a left-wing and what I would consider to be a justice-oriented perspective. Our criticism of people is not, I don't think, at any point in the book, for their failure to live up to our ideal of exactly what someone's politics should look like. But instead, we really do try to think about what the options were available to them in their time. And so often the narrative about people in the past is that, oh, well, that was just what the times were, and they couldn't have known any better. But what we find consistently throughout the book is that there are, throughout history, people who are articulating opposition to racism, people articulating opposition to colonialism, people articulating the opposition to patriarchy and misogyny, and those people do exist, and we can't. It would be really patronizing and really bad history writing to completely divest the actors in our book of any agency in making the choices that they made and in expressing and in doing the things that they actually did. The book is not intended to use a kind of contemporary word, cancel anybody. We're not trying to say your faves are problematic. But we are trying to have a really complicated and grown-up conversation about what people actually did. And sometimes that's a critical conversation, and sometimes that's an unpleasant and uncomfortable conversation. And that's certainly a conversation that I think Hugh and I both felt very implicated in personally, and thought it was important that we be implicated in personally.
All right, Hugh, I'm going to come to you. You write in your book that your book investigates the failure of homosexuality as an identity and a political project. Why has it been a failure?
Well, because when we look at the story of how the identity was formed in the 19th century and how it's developed, we can see these pressures that were put on it as a result of the milieu in which it was formed, the conversations that we're having around it, its relationship in the early days, especially towards a sort of scientific sexology and also a criminal justice framework, which actually helped create the identity. which really baked into the idea of homosexuality certain strands that have been really detrimental towards social justice, towards the lives of lots of people. So, for example, its relationship with a sort of masculinism, which manifests in some really unpleasant figures around the far right politics. The fact that it's formed in Europe through a discourse that's very much tied towards colonialism. So that a lot of these presumptions and prejudices are built into the identity. And both Ben and I would identify as gay men. We're not looking to sort of, as Ben was saying, sort of like scrap that or cast aspersions on other people who do identify as it. But just to say that actually, in some ways, it's been really limited by its birth within that European sort of colonialist and scientific milieu, and at the same time now has really been co-opted as part of a story about the fact that the idea that homosexuality is the necessary consequence or result of the sort of Western liberal democratic process. That's a false history. The Western sort of liberal sort of consensus actually did a lot to sort of spread quite homophobic laws throughout imperialism, the phase of European imperialism, things like that. So by saying we think it's a failure, we pose that as almost a positive, a question to say, where do we go from here? That we don't have to accept these histories and lineages that have created this current identity, and that we can create something new. And so what is it that we want to create that's new, that doesn't reproduce these historical legacies?
Ben, you get the last word on this. Do you have a vision of better politics and better outcomes for the LGBTQ2S community?
I do, yes. I want us to be better allies. I want us to be better fighters. I want us to be braver. I want us to be bolder. And I want a world that's more peaceful and more just and more bountiful and more interesting than the one that we have now.
And that's where
I want us to do our part in getting there.
And that's where we're going to leave it. Ben, Hugh, thank you so much for joining us on the program tonight. Great stuff.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
That is the agenda for Thursday, September 29th, 2022. Tomorrow, as we mark the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, journalist and author Brandy Marin will be with us on her new memoir of struggle and the pursuit of justice. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.